Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining this Flight Free UK event on the non-CO2 impact of aviation. Hopefully, it will be a very insightful and interesting discussion. And I'm really pleased to introduce the three people who will be facilitating the discussion this evening, and that is Matt Finch, who is an industry commentator, Celeste Hicks from the Aviation Environment Federation, the AEF, and Seb Eastham, who is a senior lecturer in Sustainable Aviation at Imperial College. And thank you in the audience for being part of this event, and thanks for joining us. If you have any questions for our panelists, then please do pop them in the chat as we go throughout the event, and we'll be coming to them later. And if you are watching this event back and you have any questions or thoughts to share, then please add them in the comments below, or you can email Flight Free UK and we can pass your question on to the relevant person. So our email address is info@flightfree.co.uk. So yeah, thank you so much for choosing to spend your evening with us. To give you a tiny bit of background on Flight Free UK, we are a behaviour change charity. We encourage people to travel without flying. And we have kind of two remits to that work, which is, first of all, public education about the climate impact of aviation and inspiration to travel without flying, to travel by other means. So we run events throughout the year. Some of them are online, some of them are in person. We do several around the UK. And this one is very much an education event. So public education on the climate impact of aviation. We're going to be delving a bit into those non-CO2 impacts. And yeah, we have other events coming up this year. One in particular is called Destination Islands. So we're looking at how you can reach different islands around the Mediterranean, specifically without flying, which is such a good holiday destination. So hopefully, if you enjoyed this event, you might sign up for the next one. But also to give you kind of a little bit of why, kind of the purpose behind our online events. Obviously, we hope that they're educational and interesting, maybe even entertaining. Are we a public service broadcaster? I don't know. But it's also to give answers perhaps to some of the questions that you might hear. So we have to contend a lot with aviation narratives, often greenwashing. And if we are armed with some more of that knowledge, we can talk to our friends about it if they say, oh, but I thought you could fly carbon neutral if you just do this. So hopefully these events do give you the some more of the kind of narratives that will help to counter some of that greenwash or some of the things that are put forward by the aviation industry, perhaps. So hopefully, yes, it will be enjoyable and useful. But that's enough for me right now. Let's hear who our speakers are. So Matt, would you like to introduce yourself first to our assembled audience, please?
Yeah, sure. Matt Finch, I say industry commentator, and I was previously at Transport and Environment. So I was the UK policy manager, actually covering all modes of transport in theory, but I, in practice, spent a lot of my time, perhaps too much of my time, on aviation issues, just because they're actually the interesting ones, to be honest. Prior to that, I've worked in climate policy since 2011, across a range of NGOs. And a range of sectors, but since 2016-ish, I have specialised in transport.
Thank you, and it's wonderful to have you. Celeste, would you like to go next?
Hi everybody, nice to meet you all. So I'm Celeste Hicks, I'm the policy manager at AEF. I started about 6 or 7 months ago. And before that, I also had a stint at Transport and Environment. But before all of that, I was a journalist. I worked for the BBC World Service for a long time. And to cut a very long story short, I ended up writing a book about expansion at Heathrow Airport, which looked into the legal challenge in 2019 against Heathrow Airport. So, you know, thanks, Matt. So up until about 2 weeks ago, I was like, oh, you know what? I missed my moment. I was too slow. No one cares about Heathrow expansion anymore. I'll never sell any books. And then 2 weeks ago, everything went crazy. So now I'm kind of glad that I put that work in and I sort of have something useful to contribute to the debate. But yeah, now at AEF we cover all aspects of aviation policy. So, you know, not just expansion, but non-CO2, SAF, all sorts of stuff, including behaviour change as well. So yeah, we're sort of all-round policy specialists.
Thank you, Celeste. And here is the said book. Why don't you add a note in the chat to tell people how they can get a hold of a copy if they so wish. And finally, Seb, would you like?
Sure. So, as was so kindly introduced earlier, I'm Seb Eastham, Senior Lecturer of Sustainable Aviation here at Imperial College London's Department of Aeronautics. I'm part of the Brahma Institute for Sustainable Aviation, which is trying to find ways to make aviation sustainable, if at all possible. My personal research focuses on trying to understand actually what the environmental consequences of aerospace emissions are, which largely means trying to better understand all of these non-CO2 impacts and trying to advance the science of them. As an interesting side note, the first ever piece of research I did about 15 years ago was to try and quantify what the expected emissions would be from a third runway at Heathrow. So I very much understand how long this has been part of the debate.
Thank you. And yeah, really great to have our three experts with us this evening. And just to remind everybody who is attending, if you have any questions at any time for our experts, then please pop them in the chat and we will come to them as we go through the event. So yeah, run time, I should explain as well. So it's an hour and 15 minutes. So we've got roughly an hour left after our introductions. And we'll spend half an hour now on the discussion and then half an hour with questions. So that's what to expect. Okay. But just to give a bit of an introduction to the topic, which is a bit technical, and that's why you're here, Seb. So you might have heard of, well, we do talk very commonly about carbon dioxide emissions. That is mostly what we mean when we talk about emissions and aviation emissions. But there are lots of non-CO2 effects as well. So emissions from aviation that are not carbon dioxide. And we're going to clarify what those are throughout the discussion. Now, there have been estimations that the non-CO2 effects make up 2/3 of aviation's impact upon the climate. So extremely significant. But here's the sticking point. Most of those non-CO2 impacts are not included in the climate mitigation efforts, for example, the Paris Agreement, because a couple of reasons, partly because they're very complex and there's a lot of uncertainty surrounding them. But it's really difficult to regulate international aviation emissions for many reasons. We can discuss those reasons in a bit more depth if we find that that's relevant this evening. A lot of it is to do with who owns the emissions. Is it the country of origin for the flight? Is it the country they're going to? Is it the airspace through which they fly? So that there are lots of complications there. The main kind of strategy for aviation industry to reduce emissions is called CORSIA. That's CORSIA, and it stands for Carbon Offsetting and Reduction Scheme for International Aviation. And that doesn't include non-CO2 effects. That is carbon dioxide only. And just to give you a slight bit of information, again, we'll probably be discussing this in more depth later, but CO2 is a long-lived emission, greenhouse gas, sorry. CO2 is a long-lived greenhouse gas. The other kind of non-CO2 effects are often more potent, but usually short-lived. And other sectors like agriculture, for example, is and has been working out ways to address those short-lived effects. And you'll find, for example, you'll probably have heard a lot about methane in agriculture. So that's an extremely potent greenhouse gas, but it's a short-lived one. That's also part of the non-CO2 list in aviation. So some of what we perhaps need to change the narrative towards is speaking about climate neutrality rather than carbon neutrality when it comes to flying. So you'll hear a lot of talk about carbon neutral flights, but we need to really be focusing on those climate neutral flights. That wording is important because on balance, do we need to remove more carbon dioxide to counter or make up for the fact that there are all these non-CO2 effects? But then at the moment, I mean, we're just approving airport expansion, so emissions are still going up. That means the non-CO2 effects are going up as well. And we also will be discussing the role of so-called sustainable aviation fuels in this, because there are some zero carbon fuels which would partly mitigate the non-CO2 effects as well. So that's kind of a very brief intro to some of the considerations and the issues here that we'll be covering. But yeah, let's kind of get into the technical side, I suppose, or maybe not too technical, but more of a simple explanation. So I don't know, Seb or Matt, do you want to kind of run through the list of those non-CO2 effects? Seb, maybe that's for you to do.
Happy to. And I'll comment a little bit as we go through, but let's start by just saying that we've got CO2. We understand reasonably well that when you emit some CO2 into the atmosphere, it's going to stick around for hundreds of years and contribute to global warming. That's sort of the baseline understanding. Every time that we burn some kerosene, you're going to get some CO2. The first non-CO2 effect that would be a concern would be emissions of nitrogen oxides, NO and NO2. These are also an air quality concern, which is something I don't want to leave entirely off the table. But when they're emitted into the atmosphere, and in fact, this is a larger concern when they're emitted at high altitudes, they go on to result in the formation of ozone. They have this long chemical cascade, including effects on methane, on water vapor, that results in a series of warming and cooling effects. The balance of whether or not you have warming at any given time depends on that time. So if you look, say, 10 years after an aircraft has flown, you would expect this nitrogen oxide related warming effect to be positive, to be an overall global warming effect. 100 years down the line, it may actually have dipped back down to a cooling. This is a very difficult problem to deal with. But nitrogen oxides are one of these emissions that we're concerned about. You also have emissions of soot and water vapor, which together result in the formation of contrails. Contrails are the white clouds that occur in aircraft exhaust. On average, about 2% of all kilometers traveled by any aircraft results in the formation of contrails that persist for a long time. Those contrails both reflect out some of the incoming sunlight, giving actually a small local cooling effect, but they also trap some of the heat that the Earth is trying to get rid of all the time, resulting in yet another global warming effect. Interesting thing about contrails is that they cause a very large local warming for a short amount of time, which then has knock-on effects for the next 10, 20 years as the Earth system retains that heat. Those are the three really most prioritized warming effects: carbon dioxide, nitrogen oxides, and then contrails. Other components that have been thought to matter are things like sulfur, soot on its own, water vapor, but really the debate centers on those three.
Thank you, Seb. I think that was pretty succinct, and hopefully everybody kind of got the measure of it. And so just to clarify, so when maybe Celeste, I don't know if you can clarify on this one. So we talk, because to the lay person, we try to include some of these effects. When we talk about CO2 emissions, we often talk about CO2e emissions. And the purpose there is to bundle everything together, because the E stands for equivalent. Are you able to explain that, do you think, for kind of people to generally understand?
I mean, only very generally that it's a CO2 equivalent, so it includes all the greenhouse gases, and I believe that's because of Kyoto, that under Kyoto that we included other greenhouse gases, so that's things like methane as well. So I how that relates to non-CO2, I don't actually know, but not a CO2e is making sure that you get all of the warming potential of all the gases that were included.
Matt, is that your understanding?
Probably explain it better.
Yeah, broadly, yeah, that's completely right.
Go on, how would you explain it, Matt?
Well, I think the difference is between CO2 and non-CO2. Don't get me wrong, Celeste is completely right. Non-CO2 is slightly different when we're talking about aviation because it's not constant. I.e., we know that when some methane goes into the atmosphere, it causes X amount of warming. What we don't know, or the difference is, one flight could fly one route, burn exactly the same amount of fuel 1 week, then do it the next as the next week. On one of those flights, because of the weather around where it flies, contrails don't form, and on another one, contrails do form, and therefore the warming effect of one of those flights is a lot more than the other one. Now, we are beginning to understand where these regions are going to be, and so therefore it's going to become far more predictable to work out where contrails will form, the white lines of pollution in the sky will form. But the science is still getting there, to be blunt. So hopefully that made sense.
Yeah, that does. Thanks, Matt. And we're going to be talking in quite a lot of detail about contrails, and because there are measures at the moment put forward by various players to reduce contrails and how we can do that. So we'll come to that in a minute. And to stick with the technical terms, though, another term that people might have heard is radiative forcing. So this is the warming effect of all of the emissions from aviation, including the non-CO2 effects, because as you've just explained, Matt, or hinted at, the warming effect in the upper atmosphere is different to the warming effect of those particular greenhouse gases at ground level. There are many factors that affect that. And so, I mean, maybe Seb, you can kind of clarify or confirm or deny if that's the best explanation for radiative forcing. It is the fact, and because it only applies to aviation, because those greenhouse gases emitted in the atmosphere behave differently to how they do at ground level.
So radiative forcing is a generic term, which basically says if you treat the entire Earth as a system in balance, you'd say it's got some amount of energy coming into the system from the sun generally, and some amount of energy going out. And that's because Earth is at a temperature, it radiates out heat. Anytime that we perturb that balance, we cause a radiative forcing. So you can quantify a CO2 radiative forcing, as with anything else, because it causes more of this energy to be retained in the system than it would otherwise. Aviation has its own radiative forcing agents, in the sense that contrails are unique to aviation, and the nitrogen oxide effects from aviation are quite unique in the sense of it coming from where they come from. But actually, every sector you can quantify the radiative forcing for. How you compare that and how you integrate that over time, and how you compare radiative forcing now versus 100 years in the future, that's where you run into these very tricky questions about CO2 equivalence.
Not easy then. Thank you, though. That's helpful to kind of focus our thoughts on that one. Thank you. So this actually, I was going to just add a little bit of a narrative in here, because this is often why when industry bodies talk about the emissions from aviation, it's often a low estimate, whereas environmental groups, understandably, will include those radiative forcing effects or the non-CO2 effects, and so the overall the overall warming effect will be higher. So the contribution of aviation to overall global heating is 2 to 3 times higher than that of the CO2 alone, and those figures are commonly left out by the industry in terms of narrative. Celeste, I know on the AEF website there's a very handy chart which perhaps we can point to after this event's finished, that shows kind of the CO2 impact alone, and then adds the radiative forcing for aviation, which I think is quite good at illustrating the situation.
Yeah, so as Seb said, it's complicated because of all the interplay of the different factors. So, and generally speaking, we say it's between 2 and 3 times, depending on all the variable factors that we've just discussed. So yeah, we just use that as a standard figure because there is, and as Matt said, some flights are causing a lot more extra amounts of warming than other flights are. So, I mean, if people wanted to know a bit more about that, like that's to do with flights that go over very cold regions where the contrails are more likely to form because there's more these what they call supersaturated ice regions. So actually Tim, our director, is sitting on a number of bodies trying to kind of quantify this and just talk about how we communicate this complexity to consumers to try and give people a better, when people are booking a flight, to give people more information about how much that individual flight will contribute. So, you know, rather than just saying it's in the region of 2 to 3 times, we're actually trying to kind of be a bit more specific about it with the idea of just raising awareness, which is why it's really great to have this conversation, that there are some flights which are visibly more impactful than others. And the second part of that is modelling and monitoring. So I think Matt mentioned earlier that there's some early trials going on already. I think American Airlines has started to do it to just see what happens if they fly around these ice saturated regions, to look to see what's actually happening in the real world, because up until now it's all been done kind of just with computer models. So obviously the only way we can really know is to try to understand what's actually happening when the planes are flying through those zones. So yeah, we say 2 to 3 because of all of those uncertainties, but there is, you know, considerable work going on now to try to narrow that down a bit more.
Thanks, Celeste. And that leads us quite neatly onto a bit more of an in-depth discussion about those contrails and the formation. So Matt, do you want to take us through this one, which is what is currently being done or experimented with to see if we can avoid those contrails forming in the first place?
Yeah, sure. And one thing I was just going to say on this last point, that the easy way to think about non-CO2, because it can get really technical really quickly and already has, as you can see. Just imagine a fire. Carbon is like the wood that you put on a fire. Non-CO2, and that wood will last all night. Non-CO2 is like pouring a bit of petrol on it. The fire will flame up really high, but very quickly will go back down again. The problem with non-CO2 is we keep on pouring petrol on the fire. So, which brings me nicely to how can we stop pouring petrol on the fire, right? So the simple way is to not fly through the regions. One of the things with these regions is it's not the whole airspace that planes fly through. So it may be that planes could fly higher or lower or around these areas, and that there will still be some non-CO2 impacts, but the contrail formation will be a lot reduced, and that should, in theory, reduce the amount of climate warming. We do know, and actually this is from a chap called Mark Stettler, Seb's colleague at Imperial, that flights over the North Atlantic, because they actually, direct flights to North America fly broadly over the Arctic, and that's the straight line on a sphere. So we know that that is one of the real problem regions of the world. I would say the majority of contrail formation from flights taking off from the UK are formed over the Arctic. So that's the specific area to target. Could they be rerouted, essentially? It's the question.
Seb, have you got anything to add there?
Yeah, I think I'd say contrails are a very interesting topic. There's been a fair amount of recent research trying to understand them, and you know, Matt's point is extremely well taken. The big question is, could you do something with routing to try and avoid contrail formation? But I think that at the same time, 2 other questions come up. One is, how do we predict them? We've got satellite systems in place now that can observe contrails as they shortly after they form, which might be a very powerful tool to tell us where they're forming. But those satellite systems are imperfect, and the modeling systems are even more imperfect. even the estimates of where contrails currently are forming are very, very uncertain themselves. So it's a huge challenge. And the second question then is that even if you know where they're forming, and if you can predict that, the degree to which the amount of heat that petrol generates, using Matt's analogy, is also uncertain. And I know that at least some research groups in the UK are concerned that if we focus too heavily on non-CO2 before we really know how large the impact is, that we might compromise our efforts to reduce the CO2 emissions. And this is a very charged debate.
Interesting. Yeah. So there was quite a lot of news coverage in the last couple of weeks, though, about projects that showed if we can remove contrails, so this is how we can remove contrails, and that will instantly reduce emissions by 40%. Is that realistic? Is that just still kind of working on assumptions and experimentation? Because it really sounded convincing that, you know, if we can convince the aviation industry to do this now, then straight away we're reducing aviation emissions by 40%.
So just to jump on that, I'm part of groups that are looking at this problem and who are trying to identify, are there actions that we can take that would achieve that goal? Because rationally, even when you have this level of uncertainty, we do have a huge level of uncertainty. If there is something we can do which we can have a high degree of confidence would reduce the climate impacts of aviation, then it's our responsibility to try and figure out if we can make it work. And those efforts are fed by modeling, by satellite data. There's more research to try and improve both of those. We have engagements from government and from industry. You know, I actually think there's reasonably good alignment there, but it is still a serious challenge.
Interesting, thank you. Yeah, and of course, I must remind people at this point that we're talking about reducing aviation's impact by 40%. But of course, we know that we can reduce aviation's impact by 100% by not flying. So, and that's what our role is at Flight Free UK, to encourage people to travel without flying. So, yeah, this is all part of the conversation. But don't worry, we're still going to be going hard on that one. Okay, well, let's think a little bit about so-called sustainable aviation fuel, because in theory, if we are using zero carbon fuels, that will also help to reduce or mitigate those non-carbon effects. So does any one of our panelists have a particular expertise on that, or want to come in and comment on that one? Go on, Matt.
Yeah, I can comment on this. So it's really important to remember exactly what sustainable aviation fuel or alternative fuels are. They are a set of processes that take a raw material, what are called feedstocks, and turn that thing into something that's chemically identical to fossil jet fuel, so it can be put in a plane and burned. That's important because, in theory, you could have a net zero, i.e. the fuel has taken carbon away from the atmosphere somehow, and then it's burnt and the carbon goes back in the atmosphere. But it's not zero carbon because it puts carbon in the atmosphere. And again, in theory, there are good ways to make some SAFs, which should result in far less of these impurities, far less soot particles, for instance. However, then it gets a bit complicated with engines. So some older engines need something that are called aromatics. And if you produced a soot, ICAO, the governing body for aviation, says that jet fuel has to have a minimum level of aromatics in it. Now, the unburnt aromatics are the things that form contrails. So even if you produce SAF that didn't have any aromatics in it, under current rules, you would have to add them back in, so you don't solve the problem with SAF, is the short answer.
Anything to add there, Seb? And Celeste in a second.
No, I think that's fair. There's the question of CO2 balance and how you guarantee that balance, I think is very important. A second question, which I think is also important, is that the effect of removing soot on contrail formation is quite hotly debated right now. There's most observations, I won't get too far into it. Most observations focus on near field contrail effects. We're still concerned about whether or not this actually results in a long-term contrail impact, which means SAF may not, even ideal SAF may not get us all the way there. And then I think that something that Matt mentioned, which is worth just really focusing in on, is feedstock. The question of, will the SAF achieve the carbon benefit? Will the SAF achieve the contrail benefit? Doesn't answer the question of, can we make enough of it? Even if you had the perfect SAF, we can't currently make enough of it.
Celeste, I wonder if you have anything to add on SAF, given that it's quite a lot of what you're looking at AAF as well.
Yeah, I do. I just wanted to just sort of like go back slightly on the point that we were discussing before this, which is just so that like it's clear that we're talking about the warming impacts of aviation and not reducing emissions from aviation. So what the contrails do is kind of double the impact of it. So if you take if you theoretically are able to take the contrails away, you're still left with the CO2 impacts. So I'm kind of like, I think this is kind of what Seb was just alluding to with the hot debate with the scientists, and I'd be really interested to follow up with Seb after this to find out what's going on, because I've sort of had a lot of thoughts that the contrail, you know, if the science is correct, and or the science we think we know is correct, and that you could theoretically fly around and not create these contrails, and that would reduce the net warming impact. You'd still be producing CO2, and that CO2 is still going to be there. So I'm just worried from a political point of view that it could turn out to be quite an easy thing for the aviation industry to go around saying, hey, look, guys, we've flown around, we've stopped these contrails, look at all this work we've done this amazing thing, we've reduced our warming impact by X%, but actually what they've done is just continue emitting CO2. And at that point, we then say to them, yeah, but you still need to reduce your CO2. It might be very politically difficult for us to do that, because they'll be like, well, guys, you know, we've just spent billions flying around these contrails, we've done our bit. So I think like that's the sort of political question I'm interested in. But on SAF, yeah, I mean, exactly as Matt said, I do think there's a real common misconception that sustainable means low carbon, and it doesn't. It just means a closed loop. So instead of taking the fossil fuel out of the ground and adding CO2 into the atmosphere that's been buried away for millions of years, all you're doing with SAF is theoretically growing plant matter or whatever it is that you know, or avoiding waste and taking that carbon, making it into fuel, and then re-releasing it. So the real problem with SAF is just being able to be completely sure that that process is watertight, and that you do know that whatever you've said is the theoretical justification for saying this thing has life cycle emissions savings can be proved. And my big fear is now that, you know, we'll have, obviously with all the Heathrow discussion and the SAF mandate that's coming in the UK, there's a huge political pressure and an industry pressure to create more SAF now. And I just think being able to verify all of that correctly to make sure that this closed loop is actually a thing and not just a sort of theoretical thing on paper that can't be proved, that's my real fear with SAF.
Yeah, and for any attendees who want to have a bit more, to delve a little bit more into SAF, so that is so-called Sustainable Aviation Fuel. We have posts on our website about specifically about that and the different feedstocks that you are looking at. We've analysed those. We previously, about this time last year, we ran an event called "Is there anything sustainable about sustainable aviation fuel?" So that's also available to watch. And we have a podcast episode about green or carbon neutral flying, and that includes a discussion on SAF. So if you are interested to follow up a little bit more, if you want to read a bit more and delve into that topic a bit more, then those are available. And what I will do is send links around after the event to all attendees, so you'll be able to go a bit more. But Matt, I think you wanted to add something there.
Yeah, and it's kind of picking up on what Seb and Celeste just both said, and it's feedstocks really matter when it comes to SAF. And one of the best way to describe this is with an example. So anytime you hear an airline, a British airline, over the next few years say, we've used some SAF, almost inevitably, they have used some jet fuel that's been made from used cooking oil. Now, used cooking oil is a waste for sure. The problem with it is right now we already use all the used cooking oil that we produce in the UK, and we've turned it into biodiesel for 20 years. We can turn it into SAF, but there isn't going to be any more used cooking oil. So for all of that UCO that becomes SAF, it doesn't become biodiesel, and therefore fossil diesel is burnt on the roads. And so the question of the feedstock becomes so important. And actually, when you start interrogating many, potentially all of the feedstocks, you can start saying, well, actually, we can use that for something better already, or pragmatically it's already used and that's useful. So feedstocks really count in SAF, and it are the reason why, in my view, most SAFs shouldn't have the S at the first letter.
Thanks, Matt. A good illustration and example. And you might remember 10 years or so ago, McDonald's vans declared their use of biofuels on their van. So yeah, McDonald's just uses it all. So we're going to go to questions in a minute or two. We've had some interesting ones come in. So if you have a question that you want to ask generally or specifically to one of our three experts, then please pop that in the chat. But I would like to ask Matt and Celeste and Seb if you have anything extra you kind of want to add just now, just before we go to questions, if you feel there's anything that hasn't quite been said or explained yet.
I mean, I was just going to say, I think that this might come up in the questions, but just the fact that it's worth discussing the fact that non-CO2 is not in any climate targets anywhere. It's just ignored by everybody. And there are good reasons for that, as Seb said about the uncertainty. But certainly I've been thinking recently this decision on Heathrow, or the news about Heathrow, and even I'd sort of forgotten to mention non-CO2, which, it's just sort of, if it's not mentioned, then solutions like SAF seem a lot more attractive, and the real impact of aviation doesn't get across. So I think it's worth discussing maybe what options there are for getting non-CO2 recognised in climate targets.
Yeah, really good point. So yeah, it's not included in the Paris Agreement. It's not included in any of the industry general narrative towards so-called sustainable aviation as they are. So yeah, thanks for reminding us of that, Celeste. Okay, so
can I just add as well on that? Another one of the problems, it's not just that it's not included in any roadmaps, but there is nothing to incentivize airlines to try and reduce their non-CO2 impacts right now. There's no legislation. There's nothing like a non-CO2 tax, like there is a carbon tax on some of the emissions from planes. So that until that incentive is there, I don't think airlines will truly get behind whatever solution comes along.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry.
Okay, so question. Oh, go on, Seb.
I think I did just want to mention that, one, it's great to be having this conversation about non-CO2. Two, that I would also want to make sure that other environmental effects of aviation aren't left out entirely. I will always be here to harp on about air quality effects and noise effects, because they are environmental outcomes of aviation, and they are also very hard to address. But I guess maybe one small light at the end of the tunnel here is actually that the EU has announced an intent to try and pull contrails in as part of its emissions trading scheme for aviation. So it's a long way from being complete, and there's a who knows if it'll ever actually come to anything, but there's at least some evidence that some organizations are starting to consider non-CO2.
Thank you. Yeah, good point. Thanks very much. Okay, so questions then. Here's one from Eve. Thank you, from Paris. If aircraft that fly between the UK and North America avoid the Arctic, will that not lengthen the distance and their flights and thus increase fuel consumption and therefore emissions, I'm assuming? Matt, do you have an answer to that one? I think I might. Yeah, go on.
Unfortunately, the answer is maybe. So one of the slightly weird things about planes in the 21st century is most of the time they don't fly in a straight line. So when they cross the Atlantic, what they actually do is fly into essentially 5 motorways that go across. So they deliberately fly further. Now, this is just because this is the way it's always been. This is airspace modernization. If we could change those motorways, those lanes that cross the Atlantic, and in fact say, well, actually the lanes don't exist, or the lanes are going to move around based on where those ISSRs develop, that would reduce contrail formation for sure, and actually could reduce flight times and flight distances. But it is worth remembering planes generally don't fly in straight lines. We think they do, but they don't.
I was just going to add on that. So there's a piece of research which I will go and Google while we're chatting, and which was done by the Whittle. I think it was done by Whittle Lab at Cambridge. And their estimation was that it would add something like a 1% fuel burn on, like over if you sort of averaged it all out on all of the routes. So don't ask me how they came to that calculation. I just know that was a figure that they came to. And their assessment was that yes, it would increase CO2, but the impact from the reduction in the warming would be significant enough to justify that. And the second little thing to add on the end is that, as Matt says, they don't fly in straight lines, but also that they're constantly changing flight paths anyway, for whatever reason. They fly into some turbulence, unexpected like problems on flights, so there's already like a similar level of kind of fuel burn difference according to other atmospheric or sort of conditions that are happening. So I think the Whittle Lab study, which I will share, sort of suggests that it's within that range of what's already happening. Seb might have more information on that.
Thanks, Celeste. Yeah.
I'll just say I agree with everything that's been said before. There's one additional piece of information, which is that contrail rerouting, not uniformly, but a great deal of it has actually focused on vertical deviation. What that means is that contrails form in very shallow layers of the atmosphere. So when you hear about contrail rerouting, you don't necessarily want to think about a big horizontal deviation going sort of horribly out of your way. At least one study that I was involved in suggested that they would be net neutral on changes in time. We are talking about sort of potentially minutes of difference in overall flight times. And that's why we tend to get these numbers like 1%, 1.5% of CO2 increase.
Thank you. Great. So 2 questions here that are quite similar, or well, sort of, but I think both of them should go to you, Seb. I think that you probably have got a good input on these. So one of them is, so apart from the visible contrails, is there anything from the invisible water vapour in the wrong place? So is there such a thing as that? Does that contribute? And then also we want to ask about hydrogen. So this is something that is commonly spoken about in the industry, and it sounds like a really great solution. So if we're using hydrogen in a turbine rather than in a hydrogen fuel cell, then we're generating water vapour as the waste product. So it's the combustion is vapor, water vapor, but if that's in the form of cirrus cloud formation, then does that mean that on balance there's no savings at all? So yeah, the question here, I'm sorry if I have missed, if I didn't read out the question exactly. Sorry if I've butchered that one. But yes, so what's the effect of that if we go to hydrogen, the effect of which is to put more water into the atmosphere?
So this is a complicated one. I'll do my best. Water vapor into the atmosphere, the effects vary very strongly with altitude. Water vapor from, say, supersonic aviation was a serious concern and remains one because you emit it higher. And when you emit water vapor into the stratosphere, it acts as a very strong greenhouse gas. Aviation is mostly in the lowermost stratosphere or upper troposphere, where the effects from water vapor are generally considered to be negligible. So the invisible effect from additional water vapor when it doesn't form a contrail for conventional aviation is usually considered to be negligible. That's to say nothing about supersonic or indeed business jets, which also often fly higher. The question of hydrogen is fascinating. If you have fuel cell hydrogen, then you would expect relatively low temperature water vapor, which means you shouldn't expect contrails. You shouldn't expect NOx either, you just have this water vapor effect. If you have a high temperature combustion of hydrogen, then you would expect that you may be able to form contrails through a different mechanism that doesn't involve soot. This is a big question of debate in the hydrogen aviation engineering sector. And if you do that, you'll still have nitrogen oxides. So there's this question of, oh, well, we might have resolved CO2, at least with a big caveat that's coming up, but we haven't necessarily dealt with nitrogen oxides that we've generated in a gas turbine, as you might find for hydrogen or for kerosene. Two things that are worth keeping on in mind there as well. One is, this is a little bit niche, leakage of hydrogen results in a greenhouse gas effect as well. So you have to be very careful about how you supply hydrogen. There are risks that come with a hydrogen infrastructure from a climate perspective. So it's a new non-CO2 question that comes up. And I think the big one that you have to be very careful with is that hydrogen actually suffers from many of the same problems as SAF, because you have to produce it in a green way. So most hydrogen right now is made by basically breaking the H off methane, which is a fossil fuel. So if you do that, then you've now just used a fossil fuel to power your hydrogen aircraft. So you have to solve the problem of producing a very large amount of hydrogen instead now, as well as distribution, liquefaction, gasification, storage, and usage in the aircraft. It's very, very challenging.
Wow, not simple answers, but thanks for that explanation, Seb. And yeah, we have done a little bit of exploration in other events and other articles as well about that specific thing. Namely, as well, in order for hydrogen to truly be green, it needs to involve renewable energy in the process, and we don't have loads of spare renewable energy floating around like now. Should that be used to decarbonize the grid, decarbonize road transport, for example, rather than going into something that's incredibly energy intensive like flying? But can I, Seb, just one more thing on that. So this question about hydrogen that you answered so well, thank you. The end of the question says, my understanding is that for the same power, a hydrogen turbine will produce nearly 3 times the water vapor of a kerosene one. Is that accurate to your knowledge?
So in general, we would expect there to be more water vapor in the exhaust. And that's what really ends up mattering. And yes, and for the same amount of energy, we expect to produce a lot more water. But the question of whether or not of what the impacts of that are is very complicated. You really have to get into the question of how much do you think that this will affect contrail formation? And you have to get into the question of, do I think that there's a standalone effect of the water vapor itself? Generally speaking, on the former question, we'd say we're working on it. On the latter question, we'd say we don't currently expect there to be one. So yes, a lot of water, but the question of whether or not that water matters environmentally is open.
Okay, brilliant. So a couple more questions. One is asking about, so a different Ian, thank you Ian for your question, asking about achieving zero emission flight, for example, with higher energy density batteries in the future. So if we're using battery powered aircraft, the emissions are created during the generation of the electricity, not in the flight itself. But as you might know, currently the technology doesn't allow for this to be used on a commercial scale because batteries are very heavy, and electric aircraft typically a handful of seats, no more. But yeah, I mean, perhaps in the future this might be something that's possible. So any short answers on that one?
Yeah, I can come in on this. I'm old, and I worked on road transport in the 2000s, and in the 2000s in road transport, exactly the same debates were being had as are being had right now for aviation. So back then, basically everyone said that hydrogen fuel cell cars would never work, and battery electric cars would never work. They'd never be able to go far enough. And so that the solution had to be to decarbonize the fuel, to bring in biofuels for road transport. Fast forward 20, 25 years, and actually we know that battery electric cars work completely fine. All the R&D went into them. Batteries got better and better and better. They became more and more and more energy dense. And now I can't see a future where cars are not 100% battery electric. So we're now having exactly the same discussions with planes, and lots of people in the aviation sector are going, well, batteries are just not going to get better. So my answer back to them is, why not? Because there's still millions and millions of pounds and euros being spent on R&D development for batteries. Solid state batteries, we expect are going to arrive in cars towards the end of this decade. I'm not saying that all of a sudden there'll be a 200-seater plane that can fly 2,000 kilometers, but I bet you there will be relatively short and maybe only 50-seater planes that can, battery electric planes, by the end of the 2030s.
Very promising. Although I shouldn't say that, because our overall, none of this really matters if the demand for flying continues to go up, because the balance doesn't quite work. So overall, we need to bring demand down significantly and then electrify the remaining. Okay, so there are a couple of other comments and some one more question, just which I can answer actually. So Adrian, you've asked about the relatively very high energy intensity of flying, and has that been considered as a way of consumer labeling to educate the public? And that's actually, those kinds of things are part of what we look at with Flight Free UK in terms of changing behaviour. So as we know, with other industries like tobacco, giving consumers more information about the product they're consuming is a way to change their habits and their buying habits. So yeah, pointing towards the energy intensity of flying is a way to encourage people to perhaps choose something different. And in fact, there is an event specifically on that, organised by the climate charity Possible, which oh no, sorry, it's not. That's a different one. Too many events. Yeah, I'm speaking next week at Cambridge University, and I don't know if this is going to be live streamed, but it possibly is. But that's specifically about behaviour change. So I'll be talking a lot about the parallels with tobacco labelling, advertising, those kinds of things, consumer information, in order to reduce the amount people do a particular activity, using tobacco as the example. Obviously, we're trying to get people to fly less. So thanks for that. And then finally, someone mentioned about Rosebank, which is an interesting addition to the debate, because yeah, the question is, will Rosebank take our eyes off airport expansion? So Rosebank is an oil field. Actually, and Celeste, you might want to say something on this, because what we see as aviation campaigners, the climate success of the fact that that oil field has been ruled illegal because the emissions of burning the oil in future weren't taken into account in terms of the climate impact, that could also apply to aviation and to airport expansion. We're not considering the emissions of future flights when we talk about airport expansion in many cases. So is that ruling going to help when it comes to airport expansion? Which actually, as well, we've got an event in Exeter next month, which one of our speakers will be specifically looking at that. We've got Sarah Finch on the lineup, who was one of the key people on one of those rulings to bring to look at the future climate impact of burning the oil. Celeste, do you want to say anything more on that? But otherwise, we'll wrap up quite quickly.
So I was just going to say, I will answer that, but just on the labelling, there are a couple of initiatives. So EASA, which is like the European, what does it stand for? I can't remember. European Aviation Security Agency, I think, have a labelling system now that I think they introduced at the beginning of this year. So airlines can publish data about the climate impacts of their flights. I don't think they're including non-CO2, but it's voluntary. The CAA, so the Civil Aviation Authority in this country, have been consulting for about 3 years on this, and it's actually in the Jet Zero strategy that behaviour change and nudging people towards making different choices should be part of the solution. So we've fed into a consultation on that, but like I say, it's been sort of stuck in the mud for quite a long time, and I don't know whether it's going to happen. But Google also is developing a model which does involve non-CO2 impacts, and they're trying to work out how to put those on. So when you go to book your flight, instead of getting an option to carbon offset your flight once you've paid for it at the end, you'll get a sort of message that tells you before you book it that what the impacts of the flight will be. And if it includes non-CO2, then, as we were saying before, the ones that may cause contrails will probably come up as red lights. We want to say it's not going to be a green light because that means people think, oh, it's okay then. But basically, Tim, my boss, is working on that as well. But yeah, so on the emissions from the flight, so this sort of, I guess we can call them scope 3 emissions of airport expansions. So Sarah Finch's case was Horse Hill, which was in the summer. That one came back, and that was a previous a similar one to Rosebank, as in she challenged it on the grounds that the council hadn't taken into consideration those future burning of those emissions. So there was a bit of discussion at the time in the aviation community about whether that would have an impact on any legal challenge, or could be a sort of way to legally challenge or judicially review any decisions that were made on airport expansions. And I think the broad agreement was that more or less aviation is already including those emissions. So if you look at the plans that are being scrutinised right now by the government on Luton and Gatwick, which, you know, by the way, don't worry about Heathrow, because Luton and Gatwick may well get agreed in the next couple of weeks. If you'd forgotten about those, it's not we're not getting good signals on that. I saw the submission on the emissions from Luton, and they did include the emissions from the planes in flight, and they actually included the outbound and the inbound, which is against the sort of international conventions of only including outbound. But what Luton was arguing was like, okay, yeah, they're massive, but they're not that big, and if you put them in the context of the whole UK's carbon budget, this is just one tiny bit, and how can you blame us if everybody else is burning fuel? So I think Rosebank, I don't know what's going to happen, because I've been reading today that Keir Starmer's going to overrule the judge or something. Is that what's going to happen? So I don't know about that, but out of convention, I would say aviation, the emissions from the planes in flight are being considered. So I think any discussion that Rachel Reeves is having at the moment, she is assuming that the emissions from the planes, expanded Heathrow planes, will be dealt with, but her answer is they'll be dealt with by SAF. So the big question becomes, can we expect enough of an emission saving from SAF to cancel out the impact of the extra flights? And I would say the answer is a big fat no, but that needs to be quantified. So yeah, I think that basically it's become kind of standard practice that airports will put in the emissions from the flights. So I don't think there's going to be any massive change on that. But what the airports will now do is say, oh, but it's not significant. Heathrow won't be able to say that because it is significant. But, you know, the smaller airports, Bristol, Newcastle, any one of these smaller airports, that's probably the argument they will take.
Thank you, Celeste. That's a really useful illustration of what's going on. So thanks so much. I think we've just come to the end of the questions, and I'm happy to wrap it up now. No need to keep anyone longer than necessary. But Matt and Seb, if you have any final thoughts you want to just share, then please do.
My only thought is most people haven't considered non-CO2, and it absolutely should be a consideration. But we've alluded to it during this discussion that don't forget that carbon is also a massive problem from aviation, and noise and air pollution are also massive problems from aviation. So, yes, we should want things that reduce non-CO2 climate impacts, but we also want things that reduce carbon and air pollution, and don't take your eyes off the fact that there's multiple environmental problems with aviation.
Thanks, Matt. Seb, any final thoughts?
No, I think Matt put it beautifully. Very much what I would have said. You know, that there's a lot of work to be done on all of the environmental impacts of aviation, and we mustn't take our eyes off the prize just because we get distracted by the thing that happens to be most popular right now, which is right now specifically contrails.
Okay, well, thank you to our experts so much for all of that information. One of the comments we just had was that was a lot to take in, which it was. But yeah, hopefully really useful. And I'm very thankful to you for expressing it in such an easy to understand way, relatively, given because it is such a lot to take in and it's a big topic. But thank you so much to our experts, and thank you everyone for attending. I mentioned it earlier, but of course, our fundamental belief and our role and the work that we do is about getting people to not fly in the first place, because that is the most reliable and immediate way of reducing aviation emissions. So if you haven't already and you would like to, please do sign up for the Flight Free Challenge this year, which is 1 year off flying. And we offer a customizable pledge if you need to fly for work or if you have family overseas, because of course we don't know if in an emergency, then of course it's absolutely fine to get on that plane if you absolutely have to for family reasons. So there's a little bit of leeway on there, but yeah, please do take a look at our website, which is flightfree.co.uk, and see that, as I've also been mentioning throughout the evening, there's plenty of information there and some more in-depth explanations of the kinds of things that we have been talking about this evening. So I would like to say thank you for attending, and please thank our speakers, and please look out for future events on our social media channels, and have a safe and happy evening. Thank you.